She washed the dishes. She set them in the rack to dry. She dressed the way she had dressed on so many nights before, in the borrowed suit of her brother, the rough wool coat, the flat cap pulled low against the night air. And she walked out of the small adobe house on North San Pedro Street for the last time as any ordinary woman. She did not look back. She was done looking back. It was the 30th of May, 1907, in San Jose, California. The great orchards that ringed the town were in their early summer fullness. The gas lamps along San Pedro Street had long been lit, and the fire station beside number 28 burned its own lights through the night, as it always did. Inside that small adobe, a woman had lain quiet in the dark, and beside her, her husband had slept. Before the clock struck 1 that morning, the peace of North San Pedro Street would be shattered, and a woman who had spent years looking the other way would look away no more. What she did that night would become the most notorious case in the history of the Santa Clara County courts. It would be reported in newspapers up and down California by writers who could barely bring themselves to say what had happened, and its single piece of physical evidence would sit, forgotten, in a jar in the courthouse basement for the next 40 years. Before we begin, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and if forgotten stories like this one are the reason you're here, subscribe. This is all we do. This is the case of Bertha Boronda. To understand what happened in that adobe, you have to understand the two lives that had been brought together inside it. Bertha Zettel was born in March of 1877 in Minnesota to German immigrant parents who had made their way to the American Midwest by labor and by thrift. Little is recorded of her early years. What is known is that she came out to California around the turn of the century, found her way to San Jose, and was, by every account, a capable and determined young woman. She would prove as much in ways no one could have imagined. Frank Boronda came from entirely different roots. Born in 1863, he was a descendant of one of the founding Californio families, with a lineage stretching back to the early missions and the great ranchos of the Salinas Valley. By the time Bertha knew him, he was a short, mustachioed man of considerable self-regard, who held the rank of captain of a chemical engine company in the San Jose Fire Department. He was a man of the city, known in its streets, and, as it would emerge, in some of its less reputable establishments. Frank Boronda's first marriage had not ended well, and the way it ended tells you something about the man Bertha would come to marry. In September of 1893, Frank's first wife attempted to take her own life, drinking chloroform she had obtained from a local drugstore. She had told her young daughter what she meant to do, and the 12-year-old ran into the streets screaming for help. A neighbor managed to wrestle most of the chloroform away, and she survived. Afterward, she told a San Jose newspaper that Frank had been physically abusive toward her and that he had left her in poverty. 2 years later, Frank petitioned for divorce. On Christmas Day of 1901, he married Bertha Zettel. She was 24, he was 38, and at its beginning, it was a marriage of some warmth. The warmth did not last long. Within about 18 months of the wedding, Bertha had noticed that her husband's affections had cooled considerably. She began to suspect other women. Quarrels followed, and the small adobe on North San Pedro Street, which stood directly beside Frank's own fire station, became the stage for those quarrels, and for the long, exhausting silences that fell between them. The pattern, once established, repeated itself with the grim regularity of a clock that would not be stopped. Frank would disappear for days at a time. He would fail to come home for his meals. Bertha would wait, and then it would happen again. Eventually, Bertha did the only thing that seemed to offer any escape. She left San Jose altogether. She took a room in San Francisco and found work as a saleslady at a large department store on Market Street, a respectable position where a capable woman might build a little independence of her own. Frank did not come to visit her, but he wrote. He wrote letters urging her to come back to San Jose, urging her to come home, and after 6 months, Bertha relented. She returned. The relationship did not improve. The old pattern simply resumed. Frank would vanish for days. He would miss his meals at home. And Bertha would wait, in the adobe beside the fire station, as the silences grew longer and the suspicions grew heavier. She had left and been called back and found nothing changed. And by the spring of 1907, something in her had begun to give way. In February of 1907, matters took a further turn. Frank and a fellow fire captain were arrested on suspicion of election fraud, the buying of votes. Both were questioned and released, though the investigation was understood to be ongoing. The uncertainty around Frank, where he went, what he did, what accusations might yet catch up with him, deepened considerably. Then, over a 2-week stretch in the middle of May, Frank stopped coming home for his meals entirely. His work required him to spend his nights at the fire station, so his overnight absences were not, in themselves, suspicious. But Bertha could not work out how, or where, he was feeding himself. She stopped sleeping. By her own later account, she was managing perhaps an hour or two of rest a night, and in those weeks, she began to do something extraordinary. She borrowed her brother's clothing, the flat cap, the plain woolen suit, and she followed her husband through the streets of San Jose after his shifts had ended. She wanted to know where he went. The fire station stood beside their home, and Frank's routine was fixed. At the end of his shift, he would leave by the front and walk a short distance south to a street that had acquired, by 1907, a certain reputation. On the 26th of May, Frank left San Jose abruptly, without explanation. He returned the following day, though not to Bertha. He had gone to Oakland, he said, to collect a fireman's cap, and had stayed overnight at his sister's house. Bertha believed otherwise. In her mind, the pieces had assembled into a single, unbearable conclusion, that Frank was preparing to flee to Mexico with another woman, ahead of the rearrest she feared was coming. The pattern she had watched for years, she had decided, was reaching its end. Whether any of it was true almost no longer mattered. It had become true to her, and that was enough. On the 29th of May, Frank returned to the adobe and, of all things, invited Bertha to the theater. They went together that evening to one of the newer and pleasanter houses in San Jose. They took their seats. They watched the performance. To anyone looking, they were an ordinary married couple spending an ordinary evening out. They returned home, and they talked. Frank would later recall no quarrel of any significance, only a brief exchange when Bertha asked about his trip to Oakland. He said the evening had been pleasant, and that nothing had warned him of what was coming. Bertha's account differed. She said they had spoken at length. She said Frank had warned her he expected to be rearrested for the election fraud, and she said his words had opened in her a vast and exhausted despair, the despair of a woman who believed she had found the letters, counted the other women, and reached the end of everything she could bear. Shortly after midnight, on the morning of the 30th of May, 1907, while her husband slept, Bertha took his straight razor and used it upon him. The newspapers of the day would describe what followed only in the most careful and circumspect terms. It is enough to say that it was an act of deliberate, terrible precision, the crime the law calls mayhem, and that Frank Boronda would carry its mark for the rest of his life. What happened next was witnessed by the men on duty next door. One of the firemen was the first to see Frank Boronda stagger through the back entrance of the fire station, covered in blood, crying out in pain, barely able to stand. The men acted at once, working to stop the bleeding, and Frank was rushed to the hospital. His injury was severe, and the danger of blood poisoning was real, but the doctors were confident he would survive. Back at the adobe, Bertha had already gone. She had made her way through the night streets to the north end of the city, where she had put on the suit of men's clothing. The police searched for hours and did not find her. It was more than a full day later that she was located near the railway depot, dressed in the borrowed suit, in the act of mounting a bicycle, preparing to ride away. She was taken to the city jail, and upon her capture, she admitted plainly what she had done. She expressed no regret. She had wanted, she said, to be revenged on the husband she believed had meant to desert her. She had lost her senses for a time, and she had done this thing. Frank Boronda lay in his hospital bed while the doctors worked to save him from infection. The examining physician would later testify to the severity of the wound and to its deliberate, precise character, an injury that had required intention and force. On the 1st of June, with Frank propped up in his cot, he swore a formal complaint against his wife, charging her with the crime of mayhem, the felony, under California law, of maliciously depriving a person of a part of the body, or rendering it useless. It carried a maximum sentence of 14 years. Bertha was held in the San Jose City Jail in lieu of a bond of $10,000, a sum far beyond the reach of any ordinary working woman. Even before the trial began, something unusual was already apparent. Considerable public sympathy had formed for the accused woman, and when the time came to seat a jury, finding 12 impartial men proved to be a long and difficult undertaking. The trial of Bertha Boronda opened in January of 1908 in the Superior Court at San Jose before Judge James Welch. The courtroom was crowded. Frank Boronda was the first witness for the prosecution. He testified that the evening at the theater had been unremarkable, that there had been no quarrel worth noting, and that the attack had been entirely unprovoked. Then came the other witnesses, the firemen who had first come to his aid, the police, the doctor, a neighbor who spoke of the couple's strained relations and of Bertha's earlier expressions of suspicion. Several testified that Bertha had spoken, in the weeks before, of doing her husband harm if she ever caught him being unfaithful again. Then Bertha herself took the stand. Her defense was one of what the papers called emotional insanity, arising from extreme jealousy. She described the years of suspected betrayal, the letters she believed she had found, the months of separation, the sleepless weeks of following her husband through the streets in her brother's clothes. And she said that on the night itself, she had no memory of what had taken place, that she had blacked out in a state of rage and had come to herself only afterward. The judge, in his instructions to the jury, allowed her no such refuge. Jealousy, he told them, was no excuse for the crime of mayhem. The law, he said, knows no distinction of sex in crime. A woman is as answerable to it as a man. The jury retired, and after 2 hours, returned. They found Bertha Boronda guilty of mayhem. She was sentenced to 5 years in San Quentin. On a leap day, in February of 1908, Bertha Boronda was photographed at San Quentin as part of the prison's intake. By the custom of the time, the photograph was taken by a fellow inmate. What it shows is a woman in a dark dress, composed, her gaze level and steady, her expression, in the view of many who have studied it since, closer to satisfaction than to remorse. She is not, by any reading, the face of a woman who is sorry. She served 2 years of her 5-year sentence and was released, for good conduct, at the end of 1909. Frank Boronda, meanwhile, found his position in the fire department untenable and resigned. He returned to the family ranch near Salinas. During his time in hospital, he had, by one account, become attached to one of his nurses. He married her and had a child, and later married for a 3rd time to a woman 33 years his junior. He died in 1940, at 77. Bertha found work as a hotel chambermaid and then as a waitress in the redwood country of Northern California. She married once more and divorced and died in 1950 at 72, buried in a Catholic cemetery on the east side of the same city, whose streets she had once fled through the dark in borrowed clothes. And there is one final footnote. In the 1940s, a local historian was called to inspect the basement of the San Jose courthouse during renovation work. In a cupboard holding the physical exhibits of old trials, he found a glass jar, labeled as Exhibit A in the case of the People versus Bertha Boronda, its contents preserved, all that remained of the most notorious case the county's courts had ever seen. The newspapers of 1907 had been careful never to say plainly what Bertha had done. She herself was no less careful. When it was over that night, she is said to have walked to her nephew's room and remarked, with perfect calm, that Frank had cut himself. She never said otherwise. She never expressed regret. and she looks out of that leap day photograph still, composed, unreadable, a woman who had decided, long before the shutter fell, that she was finished apologizing. If this story stayed with you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if you believe cases like this one deserve to be remembered, subscribe. The next one is already coming.